Well, howdy everyone. Today I'm taking a look at another legacy camera lens, the long discontinued Canon 70-210mm f4. Why am I looking at this lens? Well, the maximum aperture of f4 throughout its entire zoom range technically makes this an equivalent to the current, very popular Canon 70-200mm f4 USM L lens, except it's about 1/8 the price, and there are plenty of them to be found over on eBay. It obviously won't have the same very high build quality as a Canon L lens, but some have reported it to be pretty sharp, so it's potentially a real budget option for telephoto work. And 70-210mm is a nice telephoto range. I slightly prefer it on a full frame camera, where 70mm is still just about wide enough for group shots or pictures indoors. It's a very telephoto zoom range on an APS-C camera. The constant maximum aperture of f4 is nice, as most telephoto lenses only let in about half as much light when you zoom all the way in. As you've seen in the footage so far, this lens is not image stabilized. The build quality of this lens is seriously old school. It actually feels quite solid and nicely built, but also quite light, as well as being a bit ugly, the poor thing. The front element of the lens is only 58mm in diameter, which is small for a lens of this type and causes some problems with vignetting, as I'll show you later. It has quite a fun push-pull zoom mechanism, which is actually extremely smooth, as you can see in this video footage. My copy of the lens didn't really have major problems with zoom creep, unless you held it upside down, so it's actually a nice design. The focus ring is a little rough to use, and it makes the front element of the lens twist and extend. This lens does not have full-time manual focusing, but it does have a clutch mechanism, so you can safely turn that focus ring even when it's switched to autofocus. The autofocus on this lens is a bit slow, and it's also very noisy. It also tested rather inaccurately on both my cameras. I may have had a slightly bad sample of the lens, but I can't imagine it would be that much better normally. So when it comes to build quality, push-pull zoom equals cool, 1990s autofocus equals lame. Moving on quickly, let's look at picture quality. We'll start on a full-frame camera, a 20-megapixel Canon 6D. At 70mm with the aperture wide open at f4, we see good sharpness in the center of the image, but quite a strong lack of contrast, so it doesn't look very punchy. The image is exactly the same in the corners, so at least they're sharp too, and there isn't much in the way of chromatic aberration to worry about. However, if you stop the lens down to f5.6, you get much better brightness, contrast and sharpness from the corners right back into the middle. So the lens gives a very nice image from about f5.6. Let's zoom in a little to 135mm. With the aperture open at f4, again we do see some sharpness, but also very poor contrast levels, including some ghosting, which you can see here in the windows. The corners are slightly softer, and they're also quite dark from the effects of vignetting, but at least there isn't much in the way of chromatic aberration to worry about. The good news is that, once again, stopping down to f5.6 makes a big difference to sharpness and brightness in the corners and contrast across the whole image frame. There's not really any further improvement when you stop down to f8, so nothing really to write home about here. Finally, let's zoom all the way into 210mm, and it's essentially the same story in the middle of the image, fairly sharp but low contrast. The corners of the image aren't looking healthy at all. They're very dark, a bit soft, and we can see green and purple chromatic aberrations turning up in the contrasting edges of the windows. Stop down to f5.6 and image quality in the corners becomes acceptable again, although even stop down to f8, they're not the sharpest, and the chromatic aberration is still there. So the lens puts on a relatively weak show on a full-frame camera when the aperture is open at f4. There are major issues with poor contrast levels across the zoom range and meagre corners at 210mm. You need to stop the lens down to at least f5.6 to get a good performance out of it, which kind of defeats the point of getting an f4 zoom lens. Well, so much for full frame. Let's check out the picture quality on one of Canon's less expensive APS-C cameras, in this case an 18 megapixel Canon 60D. At 70mm with the aperture wide open at f4, we see unimpressive sharpness and contrast levels in the center of the image with ghosting on contrasting edges. The corners of the image only get softer. Disappointing. Stop down to f5.6 for an improvement in sharpness and contrast in the corners, and the middle of the image looks good. There's another slight increase in sharpness at f8, although as you can see here, we still have to deal with green and magenta chromatic aberrations on contrasting edges, as you can see in these windows. A pretty weak show. Zoom in to 135mm, and at f4, the image quality remains weak in the center of the image, being disappointingly soft. The corners of the image are even worse. At f5.6, brightness and contrast are better, but the corners remain a bit average, although right in the middle of the picture we can see some sharpness. Stop down to f8 for good sharpness in the middle, which continues through into the corners, although again, chromatic aberration shows up in the windowsills. Again, the lens is really struggling. Let's tentatively zoom all the way into 210mm. At f4, the picture is soft, with poor contrast from the middle of the image all the way into the corners. Stop down to f5.6 for that characteristic improvement, but it's only at f8 do we get a usable picture, and we're still seeing chromatic aberrations. The middle of the image is now sharper, but still not very impressive. So overall, the 70-210 clearly gives a pretty weak performance on an APS-C camera, certainly worse than full frame. Your pictures will be usable from about f5.6, but the demands of a high-resolution, modern digital camera are clearly just too much for this gentlemanly old lens. Let's take a look at distortion. It's not typically a problem on APS-C cameras, so let's look on a full-frame camera. At 70mm, the lens does better than average, having only to deal with very mild barrel distortion. However, if you zoom into 210mm, we see some pretty wild pincushion distortion, which will be easily visible in most pictures. Something else you might be able to see there are some pretty dark corners. This lens has serious problems with vignetting when you're using a full-frame camera. As you can see in this picture, it's particularly bad at 210mm and f4. The front element of the lens clearly just wasn't designed for that kind of aperture. Sadly, you can't load an image profile onto your camera for this lens to correct that vignetting with peripheral illumination, so you're stuck with it. It's very disturbing and quite a major problem. The lens can focus averagely close to your subject, but you might not want to use it for macro work, as the close-up picture quality gets pretty ugly, as you can see here. It gets slightly sharper as you stop down to f5.6, and the picture quality is okay at f8. Another disappointment is that the quality of the lens's background blur, or the bokeh, is a bit harsh and looks quite busy. Look at those hard edges in this picture. It's not nice at all. The lens's work against bright lights is pretty average. When the sun is in the frame, you're definitely going to get some flaring and even less contrast than ever, particularly when you zoom in. Overall, the Canon 70-210mm f4 is disappointing on many levels. I was really hoping it would be good. The picture quality on APS-C cameras is really weak, and while it's a little better on a full-frame camera, it's still far from impressive, and the levels of vignetting and pincushion distortion at 210mm are hideous. You get the feeling that Canon just bit off more than they could chew, trying to design such a cheap f4 telephoto lens, which is probably why the excellent L lens version was such a radical redesign. The only fun thing about this lens is the push-pull zoom, which reminds me of a pump-action shotgun, but it's just not enough to earn it a place in my camera bag. Overall, it's a bit of a disappointing lens.